Today we will be talking about how to maintain compliance, specifically PCI compliance in the cloud. Trying to minimize my GoToWebinar panel. Um, as Ron mentioned, this is a very critical component for a lot of our retail and entertainment customers because everybody has a shop online now, and when you're an e-commerce provider, how do I actually maintain my customers' data and make sure that this is safe? But not only that, how do I know what controls I need to follow for the compliance regulation? There's a lot of confusion around what is the difference between security and compliance. Security is the best practice, and then compliance is how do I actually pass the audit. We'll get into that in a little bit. We'll also talk about some of the common questions that our customers have around implementing PCI and other compliance requirements in the cloud. And then finally, how do I do this at scale? If you watched some of my other presentations, the answer is through automation. Just a little bit about Logicworks. Okay, so Logicworks is a leader in cloud migration and managed services. We specialize in highly regulated industries, including financial services and fintech, healthcare and health tech, edutech, and a number of other highly regulated compliance requirement areas, right? We're a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for public cloud professional and managed services. We have over $500 trillion in financial or transactions rather on platforms under our management every year. We are both an AWS Premier Partner and an Azure Expert MSP, and we are internally audited for multiple compliance regulations. This is PCI, HIPAA, High Trust, SOC 1 and SOC 2, ISO 27001, and then finally also GDPR. Not really an audit or certification, but it is a regulation nonetheless. And again, my name is Donovan Brady. I'm the Director of Solutions Architecture, and from New York, I play a lot of music and I play a lot of video games. Today we're going to focus on a customer of Logicworks called PartyLite. PartyLite is a global candle e-commerce company in over 20 countries, and obviously as an e-commerce company they have strict security and availability requirements. They need to always be up and they need to always be secure. If you're storing that credit card data, you need to make sure that that is locked down. Their primary challenges were reducing that downtime and the latency issues. They wanted to be able to maintain PCI compliance, but compliance requirements are both expensive, timely, and from an actual financial perspective. So how do we reduce that burden and maintain this at scale as we grow? Before we get into PartyLite, I wanted to talk a bit about what the shared responsibility model looks like in the cloud, right? And this goes for every cloud, whether you're in AWS, Azure, Google, IBM, or Oracle, anything. There are some differences that you need to be aware of when we're talking about compliance. Now you can see here there are a ton of different compliance regulations that need to be audited and certified for, right? As we mentioned a few of them before, there's PCI, there's ISO, SOC, HIPAA, High Trust, and each of them have similar but different requirements for them. Today we're going to be focusing on PCI, but a lot of the best practices for PCI can apply to some of these others, right? When we talk about the shared responsibility model, there are two sort of delineations that we think of. There's the cloud services themselves, and then there's the customer applications that are built on top of the cloud services, right? In the cloud, for AWS and Azure, for example, they need to make sure that the cloud services themselves, the software and the hardware, are HIPAA eligible, PCI eligible, and that they're locked down and compliant, right? But then it's actually up to the customer to manage the actual application and your data that is deployed on top of these cloud services. That's a lot of confusion for some customers, because when you look at AWS and Azure's websites, they say, oh, we are HIPAA compliant. So you make the assumption that, oh, if I deploy my application, then that means I'll be HIPAA compliant as well. But it doesn't stop there. There are a number of security controls that you need to manage and maintain on your end as well. So let's get into it a little bit. What is the cloud provider's responsibility versus the customer's responsibility? Let's say you're getting your attestation for compliance. That would be your customer responsibility, right? You need to go out and get an auditor to actually attest and certify that you are compliant in your applications. Hardening your operating systems to align with compliance controls, that would also be on the customer, right? Again, this is your application. They are your operating systems that are hosted on AWS or Azure, but you need to make sure that the operating system itself is actually compliant and locked down. Generating the policy documentation for cybersecurity policies. That, yet again, is up to the customer responsibility, right? Once you get your attestation, you need to maintain these documentations for future use. You need to be able to show your attestation companies that you're actually doing X, Y, and Z practices and controls. Maintaining a PCI report for public cloud data center, that would be on the cloud provider themselves, right? As we mentioned, they own the hardware, they own the actual software itself of EC2 and the virtual machines, for example. So they need to make sure that those components are secure so that when you upload your application, you don't have to be worrying about the underlying hardware or software. And then finally, regularly reviewing access controls and permissions. You guessed it, that is on the customer, right? AWS or Azure are not responsible for your personal users, for your roles, who has access to what. You need to make that determination on your back end and with your IT department, and then federate that into the cloud. So how do I become mature? How do I mature my cloud security posture and maintain compliance? Well, we think about it with 5 steps. First, you need to define what you are trying to accomplish, right? Am I trying to be HIPAA? Am I trying to be PCI? What does that mean? What are the controls that are associated? Okay, once we understand that, we need to implement and then document how we have implemented these things, right? Then we need to enforce this, make sure that on an ongoing basis, we have continual compliance. If something gets turned off, it can automatically be turned back on, for example. And then over time, we need to evolve. The security posture is changing in the cloud at all times. Cloud services are coming out with new things. There are new vulnerabilities every day. I'm sure all of you are familiar with, most recently, Log4j. They come out all the time, and so we need to evolve with the market and with the industry to make sure that our best practices are up to best practice standards of the industry. Let's talk a little bit about what it means to define these frameworks, right? There are a few different ways that we can think about this. If I'm a SaaS provider, I usually get customer requests. Somebody asks me, what are you doing? What frameworks are you following to make sure so that I know that if I use your software, I'm going to be secure, right? Usually those requests are around SOC 2. If it's an e-commerce company like PartyLite, like we were mentioning, then there's PCI. But usually we hear a lot about SOC 2. Then there's best practice. That's usually PCI. Why? Because PCI is very prescriptive. PCI says you need to have X, Y, and Z enabled, right? PHI, HIPAA, for example, is more so of a guideline, but there are still requirements, but it's less prescriptive. It's more so higher level. You need to maintain some X, Y, and Z security on these resources, right? Regulated data. I know that I have HIPAA. I know that I have PCI and PHI data, so I need to lock these specific things down. So when we're thinking about what frameworks we need to follow, that's really how it breaks down. And if we look at each of them, let's look at PCI for a second. There are different regulations and controls that you need to maintain. If you look here, there are a number of different requirements, from antivirus, from encryption, to threat detection, file integrity monitoring. Now, you can leverage cloud native tools for a lot of these things. However, you also have to go to third parties like Trend Micro, Palo Alto, ThreatStack, AlertLogic. They have really in-depth machine learning AI tools to be sniffing out your packets, understand what's going on the network, what's going on my resources, so that I can maintain these compliances. Do I have antivirus installed? Sure, yeah, it's with Trend Micro, but AWS doesn't have an antivirus solution, for example. Logicworks, being a hyper-compliant provider, we can help customers with all of these, and we typically do. If we take a look at a quick reference architecture here for what a PCI workload might look like, there are a number of different security layers here. We call it defense in depth, right? At the top level from the internet, you come in through a web application firewall. That's a layer 7 firewall for your application. That's going to be looking for things like cross-site scripting, basically anything in the aWAF top 10. That's going to send traffic through to that load balancer. And that load balancer can either be a layer 4 or a layer 7 load balancer. And depending on what kind of traffic you're receiving, is going to change the security tools that you are going to leverage, right? When we're looking at the instances themselves, that's where the antivirus, anti-malware, file integrity monitoring, threat detection tools would come in, right? These are typically agent-based processes that get installed on the instances themselves. But there are a couple intrinsic things that I want to point out here. There's availability zones, there's public and private subnets, and then there's security groups around these instances, right? That's 3 layers of security. One is for regional or zonal dependencies, right? I have things in 2 different availability zones, so if one were to fail, I'm still spun up in a secondary availability zone. 2 would be the public and private subnets. If you notice, the private subnets hold all of our data and our applications. We don't want any of our data and applications to be public-facing. The only thing that's public-facing is that load balancer, and we're going to lock that down with those security groups. Those security groups allow us to have detailed firewall rules and route tables that lock down specific IP addresses and address ranges for access, right? And then if you look over here on the right side of the screen, these are some Logicworks proprietary tools that we've leveraged and built. We call it the Cloud Reliability Platform. It allows us to manage, monitor, and configure cloud environments, right? Whether that's in AWS or Azure, we leverage automation wherever we can so that we can maintain this compliance at scale. Then down here, we talked a little bit about these third-party security tools like ThreatStack, Trend Micro, Palo Alto. They're going to allow us to maintain compliance for some of those regulatory controls like the antivirus, anti-malware, things like that. Okay, so now that we understand what we need to accomplish, how are we going to implement that? Let's talk about some common questions that we hear. Do I need a WAF, or are security groups okay for me to meet my compliance requirements, right? It's a hard question. So you will need a WAF unless you have intensive security code reviews, but both are best practices at all times, right? WAF, as I mentioned, is a layer 7 protocol. It's a layer 7 firewall. So if you have application layer 7 routing, pathing to your applications, we definitely strongly recommend you having a WAF deployed, and for PCI specifically, it is a requirement, right? The network security groups are required on your instances, but the load balancer on the layer 4 specifically, not the layer 7. Second, can I bring my on-prem security tools to the cloud? Currently, I'm deployed in my on-prem data center. I've got a very strong, robust tool set of security tools. Can I bring those over? The answer is yes, for the most part, right? We need to be cognizant of a few things. One, some of these security providers have SaaS platforms that are specific for the cloud versus specific on-prem. Maybe your licenses don't actually correlate or work. There are a few other considerations around costs, right? In the cloud, you can auto-scale, something that wasn't really possible in the old days, right? So if I'm auto-scaling my resources out and I only have 5 licenses for the 5 static instances, but now I auto-scale to 30, you're going to be paying for those additional 25 licenses, right? So you need to be cognizant of what your application requirements are, how you match the demand for your application and for your provider, and your customers, and make sure that your licenses are correlated. And finally, egress filtering, right? This is a control. How do I do URL or egress filtering? How do I manage and monitor all of the traffic that's going out of my environment? Well, there are a few ways to do this, but AWS makes it really neat. There's a nifty solution called the Transit Gateway that can centralize all of your traffic through this one hub and spoke model. This is the hub of that transit gateway. And you can actually apply a virtual appliance, like a Palo Alto or a cloud native tool like the network firewall, through a default route so that all of the traffic will route through this one default route. And then that Palo Alto is going to be inspecting all of that traffic before it goes in or out of the environment, right? It's a really solid, really neat solution that's scalable, right? This hub and spoke model allows me to add multiple different VPCs or subnets or however many different connections to that transit gateway without changing the core structure of that architecture. Next, we need to document what we're doing. So we just defined it and we implemented it. We're like, okay, this is what we have to do. But then we need to be able to show our work, and nobody really likes sitting down and documenting things for hours, but it is actually one of the most, if not the most critical steps in this whole process, right? You need to make sure that everybody within your organization is on the same page for these policies and standards, as well as you need to be able to provide these documentation, the documentation to your attestation companies or compliance regulators. Next, we want to enforce that. Well, how do we enforce it? Well, I talked a little bit about automation before. One of the best ways to automate your cloud environments is through infrastructure as code, whether that's CloudFormation or Terraform or Azure Resource Management templates. We want to make sure that instead of having a human intervention so that we can have a fat finger mistake or something like that, we have everything automated and codified so that we run this through a pipeline that's getting linted and tested and then approved ultimately before getting pushed out to production. This allows us to manage the environment at scale while having really cookie cutter environments. So we're not managing snowflakes, we're not managing pets, we're really managing cattle, these ephemeral infrastructures that can be spun up and torn down in the same breath. There are also some cloud native tools that allow us to maintain configuration drift or limit configuration drift rather, or monitor it. So one of those is AWS config. I think of config as really an X-ray tool. So there are two key components that we recommend all customers deploy in their AWS environment. There's the audit trail and audit log, which is CloudTrail. And then there's config. Config takes CloudTrail, which CloudTrail says, somebody logged into this thing and made a change. Okay, great. Config shows me what that change was. Config shows me all of the blast radius effects that could have had. And then I can actually run queries with config. But that's not all. It actually allows me to define rules that are being automated in your environment to prevent any sort of configuration changes, and it alerts you and notifies you if something did change so you can go in and remediate that. And finally, we need to evolve. The goal is not perfection, but actually improvement, right? There is no such thing as perfection in a cloud environment. As I was mentioning before, the landscape is forever changing, right? There could be something that Amazon comes out with tomorrow that's going to completely change the game, and everything that we knew of previously is null and void, right? Let's hope that doesn't happen, but there's always a possibility. So we want to make sure that we are evolving with the landscape and we're not stuck in the past, right? And one of the ways that we can do that is to continually look back and ask yourself questions during and after an audit, right? One, have I documented all of the risks that they identified, right? What am I looking at in the environment? And is there a process for us to actually get around these things? Do we have a path for addressing these risks? Are there protocols? Do we have escalation policies or vulnerability escalations, right? Are we measuring the progress against this improvement? Okay, so we said at the beginning of the year that we're going to do all these amazing security improvements, but are we tracking them? How are we tracking them? Do we have KPIs around them, right? And finally, are we dedicated? Do we have a full InfoSec team? Do we have a CISO? Are we doing monthly or quarterly compliance assessments to make sure that we are actually in line with what we are trying to accomplish? These are some questions that you need to ask. Oops, sorry about that. So if we put all of these things together, we get that case study for Party Light that we were talking about before. PartyLight was migrating from their existing hosting provider to AWS. We actually allowed them to do that within 30 days, right? By using those infrastructure as code templates and automation that I was referencing before. We leverage automation deployments via CloudFormation pipelines to ensure repeatability and accuracy, and then that continuous compliance over time, right? No fat fingering, no manual errors. We know that since this is an automated pipeline, it's going to be tested and then ultimately approved before it goes into production. We talked a couple times about that hub and spoke model. It allows us to scale with the growth of the company, but it also allows us to centralize that governance in a few key components rather than having multiple different components across the environment doing the same thing. And then finally, a 24/7 NOC and SOC, where we have the combination of automation, those tools that we were talking about, ThreatStack, Trend Micro, that are giving us intel on it, but then we also have human experts that will drill in and look at what the actual issues are and then take any remediation action necessary. That's pretty much it. Thank you, everybody, for joining our talk. My name is Donovan Brady. I'm the Director of Solutions Architecture at Logicworks, and you can contact us to learn more about cloud compliance or schedule an assessment. Thank you.